Welcome to a Glastonebury Romance, part tray. You might notice that I'm wearing the same clothes. I will change them later today. Last time I had a question about who was the reference in, at some point he made reference to Scopus. And since nobody left a comment about Scopus, I looked up Scopus. And Scopus is the ancient Greek sculptor and architect most famous for his statue of Meleager, the copper statue of Aphrodite, and the head of goddess of Hygeia, daughter of Asclepius. So that's what he was making reference to when he was talking about Scopus at some point. We begin now on page 24. I'm not even going to go into what happened last. I think he was getting off a train and walking somewhere after feeling the first cause. This is John Crow, our plucky protagonist. Bending his head a little above his tightly buttoned greatcoat collar, John Crow began to recall now certain actual moments of his recent nights with young Lisette and old Pierre. These moments, as he butted his way against the bitter east wind, came to his impregnated with the subtle smells of a Latin Quarter street. He saw the neat frippery of Lisette's front room. He saw the grotesque photograph of himself taken by a photographer in a street booth at St. Cloud upon her mantelpiece. He saw her absurd muslin curtains tied with great bows of green ribbon. He saw the big cracked mirror with the little carved cupids at either corner, from one of which the gilt had been chipped, revealing scars of bare wood, black as if they had been burnt in a fire. He saw these things against the far gray horizon, where as a child he had been so often told to look for the great towers of Ely Cathedral, visible across leagues and leagues of level fens. He saw them against old, stunted, lichen-whitened thorn trees. He saw them against the curved, up-pushing, newborn horns of the sap-yellow bracken, protected from the wind by the dead husks of last year's mature ferns, and crouching low like the heads of innumerable mottled snakes, the better to leap at the throat of life. He saw them against the reddish gnarled trunks of intermittent clumps of Scotch firs, and again the scuttling white tails of the rabbits and the hovering wings of solitary kestrel hawks. And over again he said to himself, "Philip will have had all grandfather's money, of course. Of course Philip will have had all grandfather's money." At one point, when he came to a place where Brendan Heath seemed to gather its personality together and to assume a scrutinizing, haughty, an inquisitive look, as much as to say, "Who in the devil's name are you, you dog-faced foreigner?" In reply to the look of Brendan Heath, John muttered a sulky defiance and ejaculated out loud, as if to let the place know that he was more than a common tramp, "I shall make Philip give me a berth of Glastonbury." He had been on foot now for about an hour, and he had been walking fast too, for the bite of the cold air seemed to give an energy of demonic malice to his defiance of the wind, of the sun, of the hostility of the earth. He had begun to notice, too, that the heath scenery was transforming itself by degrees into ordinary farm scenery, when he heard a motor car coming up fast behind him. Oh, I wonder who it's going to be. He stepped hastily to the grass by the roadside, and without the least idea as to why he did so stood stock still and stared at the approaching machine. "Nothing would induce me to take a lift," he said to himself. "It must be a good 2 hours still before the time." The cow, however, lessened its pace and momentarily stood still, and as soon as it reached him, stopped dead. "Canning Crow's funeral, sir?" The driver's voice had that peculiar updrawing, up-tilting, devil-may-care intonation, no doubt derived from a long line of Danish ancestors, which renders the Norfolk tongue different from the speech of every other English country. I don't think I did it justice, but whatever. John Crow looked up at the speaker. There was something in the man's tone that gave him a totally unexpected emotion. A lump of long frozen tears began to melt in his throat, a frozen lump 20 years old, compounded of all the memories of his childhood, composed of the image of his grandmother reading to him in the low-ceilinged, old-pictured, old-brocaded rectory drawing-room, composed of the image of his grandfather with his snow-white hair and short, wavy curls covering his round, brittle-looking skull, and his voice melodious as a great actor's. Mingled with these came memories of the taste of a certain species of unusual pink-colored strawberries that grew in the walled garden and the sharp, pure taste of red gooseberries that grew from near the manure heap there. And surrounding all these, as if by an atmosphere of something still more intimately felt, there came over him, upon the impact of the Norfolk utterance, an impression of acrid smoke, the smoke of burning peat, rising from innumerable cottage hearths. "The funeral, Northwood, thank you very much," John Crow replied in broken phrases, and his own voice was to him as the voice of one speaking in a dream. As he uttered the words, his eyes glanced in a bewildered daze over the contents of the motor car. The back seats were all piled up with neat and very new traveling bags, canvas hold-alls, and bright rugs, from among which an elderly, gentle, majestic-looking woman smiled at him in an extremely reassuring manner. "There's room up here, then, mister," went on the driver, after a hurried turn in his seat and a glance backward at the lady amid the pile of bags. "That's to say," he added, with an appeal to a figure at his side, whose presence had hitherto escaped John's notice, "unless you object to being crowded, miss." The pulse of time that followed this remark was one of the most singular in all John Crow's experience. It was not, in fact, like a pulse of time at all. It was like a perfectly calm and perfectly quiet sinking aside into a region altogether outside the jeopardies of the agitations of time. John and the young girl who was seated on the further side of the drivers exchanged a long stare. "You don't mind, miss, do we?" repeated the man. "'Tis a long walk for the gentleman, and the canon would wish all that come to his burying to be treated proper." The nervous mouth of the young person he thus addressed, which had mechanically opened, showing a row of long, strong, white teeth, shut abruptly, and her eyes, which had begun large and round, became little dark-lashed slits in her sallow face. "Of course not," she murmured in a low voice, making herself extremely small and pressing close to the man's elbow. John Cow walked round the rear of the machine, and after a moment's clumsy fumbling at the handle, pulled the door open, clammed up, and sat down by the girl's side. "All comfortable?" asked the driver. "Very, thank you," came to simultaneously from both John and the young girl, and it sounded incoherent. The man, however, started the car without further parley. "Is my nephew expecting you to lunch?" came the pleasant voice of the majestic lady from amid the luggage. "I wonder if you are one of the cousins?" she went on. "There are really a terrible lot of us, and we shall all be there." There was a pause during which the driver remarked that there wouldn't be many of the local people either who'd stay away. They respect Canon Crow in Northwood more than anybody would suppose, seeing how little he came out towards the end. "He speaks as if grandfather was a snail," thought the young girl. "My father liked his books better than visiting," the lady continued. "But he used to read beautifully at people's bedsides." "Oh, like me. I've heard him do that often when I was little. Some clergymen have such poor voices." "I never heard and read myself," replied the driver thoughtfully. "Maybe 'twould have been better if I had. My dad brought me up chapel, and chapel I've stayed, though I've often thought 'twere a pity. Chapel be all for salvation, but it neglects the King's majesty." "That's where we used to look," broke in John Crow suddenly, addressing the girl as if he had been completely alone with her. "For the towers of Ely." He pointed with his hand over the wide horizon, and half rising from his seat strained his eyes to catch a glimpse of what he remembered. "Oh, it's too late," he added, and sank by her side. "These cars go quieter than pony carts. Grandfather used to drive a pony called Judy." "I'm beginning to think I know who you are," resumed the elderly lady. Aren't you my nephew John, who went to live in France? It was the girl who replied for him. Yes, Aunt Elizabeth, he's Cousin John. I knew him at once. You used to come with us sometimes yourself, when John took me down the little river in the old boat. Don't you remember, Aunt Elizabeth? He was with us that day we went to Oxborough Ferry, when Cousin Percy was there. Cousin Percy wouldn't fish with worms. You must remember that, Aunt Elizabeth. She kept putting bits of purple loosestrife on her hook. There was a nervous exultation in the girl's tone that her aunt did not miss. I knew Mary at once, too, John Crow said, turning around to address their relative. But you used to be very busy when I stayed at the rectory, so it's no wonder we didn't know each other. Dear Aunt Elizabeth. And with a rather exaggerated foreign gesture, he stretched out his arm and, capturing the stout lady's hand, lifted it up to his lips. I came every summer to Northwood, you know, he said, and he remembered for a minute leaning sideways and holding the hand he had taken. And I came when he came, cried Mary, with an abrupt and awkwardly intensity, and she too turned and leaned back and took possession of her aunt's other hand. Thus, with their faces so close to each other that the girl's hair brushed his cheek, the two cousins, for an appreciable passage of time, clung to the elderly woman as if their mutual contact with her brought them closer. And thus they entered the outskirts of the village of Northwold. It was Miss Elizabeth Crow who made the motions to release their fingers. Well, perhaps we'll leave it at that for today. Well, it seems like some things are happening now. So, that was Glastonbury Romance, Part 3. Take up tomorrow. Leave your comments on what's gone so far. Do you think he's going to date his cousin or something? Who knows? Cheers.